Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Cyber Talks panel discussion, Fundamental Causes of Vulnerabilities and How Incident Handling Can Solve Vulnerability Issues, by our speakers, Stephanie Thomas and Rico Danielson. I am Prithama, and I'll be your host for the day. For our attendees, the session will be on listen-only mode and will last for about an hour, out of which the last 10 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. If you have any questions during the webinar to the organizers or to the panelists, please use the Q&A tab. Also, if you face any audio or video challenges, kindly check your internet connection or log out and log into the session again. An important announcement regarding the certificate of attendance for the session. Participants need to attend the complete webinar to qualify for the certificate of attendance. Participants should fill in the survey form in the attendees thank you mail and answer the 3 questions based on the webinar provided with the right answers within the same day. If these 2 criteria are met, then only the participants will receive the certificate of attendance within 5 to 7 business days after the event. Now, a bit about our speakers before we move on to the session. Stephanie Thomas is the Director of Strategic Cybersecurity and Communications at Intel. She leads the development of complex cybersecurity and communication strategies for hardware and firmware security. Prior to Intel, Stephanie spent 8 years focused on medical device cybersecurity, leading a startup company and consulting within a broad range of manufacturers, from newest startups to the industry giants. She is the founder and lead trainer of cybersecurity training company Dazzle Cat Duo. Her past experience includes 10 years of reverse engineering and vulnerability analysis research as a defense contractor. Now, about our other panelist, Rico Danielson. Rico has elaborative experience in handling cyber incident response, cybersecurity, information security, privacy, and compliance. Rico has helped major retailers, financial and healthcare organizations to mitigate threats and risks from an information security, privacy, and compliance standpoint. Further, Rico has handled cyber incidents for major world-renowned healthcare, financial, and retail firms. He is also a digital forensics expert for criminal and civil court cases. Rico is a graduate of Thomas Jefferson School of Law, UCLA, and the University of Arizona. He is also a U.S. Army combat veteran who is actively involved in entrepreneurship. With no further delay, I would like to hand over the session to our panelists. Please start with the session, Rico and Stephanie.
Thank you, everyone.
Hey, what's going on? It looked good to be here. Good to be in front of everyone. Stephanie, good to see you again.
You too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we have a set of questions that we've kind of come with in advance that we think are some interesting aspects to talk about, from kind of roots of vulnerabilities and incident response and kind of the role it plays. And so we'll kind of go through these questions and sort of each give our thoughts on it. We both have very different backgrounds, as you heard, so it'll be really interesting to hear. I'm very much focused on the product security incident response side and how you handle from a product perspective. And from Rico, you'll hear very much kind of the corporate and infosec and infrastructure perspective, and both work together in a lot of scenarios. So it'll be great for everyone to be able to hear kind of both sides of that coin. So these are the kind of stuff that'll guide our initial conversation. And then once we get to about the 40-minute mark, we'll switch over to taking Q&A. So keep thinking of your questions and put them in the chat box. But Rico, you want to kick us off with the first question?
Yeah, so most vulnerabilities, where they're coming from and where they come from, right? From a tactical perspective, its answer can vary. It can vary in regards to not having the proper patch management, not having the proper maintenance around your specific environment, and not really paying attention what I've seen a lot of cyber breaches and also cyber incidents, if you will. Some of them, I want to say about 80% of them are self-inflicted, just because a lot of times people are not paying attention. They're standing up EC2 instances. There's no controls over them. There's no management. There's no monitoring, and it's just really self-inflicted. So a threat actor will just go out there and say, "Hey, I want to see what's going on out there. See if it's open. I'm just going to try regular stuff," and then boom, they're in there. So that's kind of where I see most vulnerabilities come from.
Awesome. And so I'll kind of give the product perspective then. So from the product perspective, the interesting piece is around sort of vulnerabilities typically coming from sort of not your special piece. So right now, I work at Intel and we do hardware, we do firmware, we do software. But before that, I worked in the medical device space. So a lot of work with embedded medical devices, just embedded systems in general, and IoT. And what we found was a number of the root causes of vulnerabilities were actually coming from the third-party components that we were including inside the system. So if you think of like any medical device, right, there is a unique piece that you are building for that thing, right? It's the thing that performs a clinical function or a medical function, and that's sort of your intellectual property as the manufacturer. But there's no reason for you to reinvent things like communications libraries and graphics libraries. And so naturally, you include a tremendous number of third-party components. And so what we found over the years of working with these medical device manufacturers was that the majority of their vulnerabilities came from those third-party components that they were including inside of their system, and that there was almost a disconnect because internally when we were doing things like pen testing and security assessments and threat modeling of the systems, we focused very much, and those manufacturers focused very much on their unique pieces, right? They spent a lot of time kind of pen testing their clinical algorithms and their clinical functions, and doing design reviews of that piece of the puzzle. But at the end of the day, that didn't actually represent the biggest risk. So we found most of the vulnerabilities actually came from these commodity pieces of software that they were including, not the special thing that they were actually making internally. So we had to have a big kind of shift in our sort of risk reduction efforts to recognize and change the focus to be on those third-party things, because they were actually the biggest risk to the system. And so we need to really make sure that that's where efforts like pen testing and threat modeling and risk assessments were actually focused. So long-winded way of saying, at least in the product level, we find a lot of it comes from the commodity ingredients that you're including in the system.
Yeah, absolutely. That can actually surmise the next question of, why there's so many vulnerabilities. I think 2020 and 2021 has been the case in the year of the third-party vulnerability, supply chain, upward mobility of specific applications, and a lot of threat actors are actually hitting up the low-hanging fruit, right? We saw that with Toughshed. Toughshed, they're a shed builder, right? However, they actually have so many other connections into other manufacturing, such as hardware, wood, manufacturing floors, and threat actors knew that, and they knew that nobody was paying attention, and nobody was really monitoring these things, and so they're just like, hey, I'm going to leverage this to get here. So it's pretty fascinating with regards to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting correlation to draw. At the product level, it's the third-party ingredients that you're including, but then at infrastructure level, it's also the third-party companies that you've given access into your systems. I mean, it's all about, like, you have to at some point work with other vendors, other pieces of ingredients, but those things are such a huge risk. There's a number of breaches and incidents that I can think of that were the result of some third party having access to a system. Yep. So kind of works at both the product and the infrastructure level, but the third party in general ends up being the risk. So what that means, as somebody who is focused on the product space, it means the products that I'm helping make are the thing that's keeping CISOs up at night, other CISOs, because I'm the products that are inside of their network causing them to have heartburn over third-party risk. So product vendors, we need to make sure we lock all this stuff down. But kind of going back to the original question about why are there so many vulnerabilities, I can't remember the exact statistics for last year, but there's all these breach reports that come out every year. And one of the fascinating statistics I always like to find is how many of these breaches were a result of new vulnerabilities. And what you typically find is it's actually very low. I think a couple years ago, the number I can remember is something like less than 10% of the breaches. This is, I think, a Microsoft report, were the result of new vulnerabilities. So things like 0 days and O days that get all this attention every time they come out. But the truth of the reality is, most breaches are not using sexy new stuff. They're using old stuff that nobody's bothered to patch yet. And so one of the reasons there's still so many vulnerabilities, I would kind of put it down to two things. One is patch hygiene. It is still, and I understand, it is very difficult to keep systems patched. Having come from the healthcare space and working with a number of hospitals on trying to maintain the security of their medical devices, I can tell you just an average size hospital has thousands of makes and models of medical devices. Every single one releases patches in a different way, on different cycles. They apply in different ways. Trying to help some of these hospitals write guidelines and processes of how they were going to keep their medical devices up to date from a patch perspective is literally near impossible, right? I mean, you're 60 pages into a process. You're like, I still haven't really reduced my risk a tremendous amount because every single one of these things is a unique snowflake. So I get that patch maintenance is incredibly difficult, but at the end of the day, that is actually one of the really big reasons that we keep seeing breaches happen from existing vulnerabilities. But the other piece is then around more of the proactive and product side, that in product development, there is still a growing maturity around doing product security well. The SANS CWE is a list of common weakness enumerations, is what the CWE stands for. And what they do is they try to classify weaknesses in systems based on kind of different families or root causes. And so when you see vulnerabilities come out and they get a CVE number, they'll often have kind of CWEs associated with them for kind of what is the root weakness that was the result of this vulnerability. In SANS CWE, every couple of years we'll refresh what they call the top 25 or the top 20 list of the common weaknesses that have been the result of most of the breaches and issues out there. And the sad thing you'll find is over the last 15 years, the list hasn't really changed. The top 20 things we're doing wrong are still the top 20 things we're doing wrong. And they're not really rocket science, right? They're things like good authentication, like input sanitization, authorizing before you allow somebody to do something inside of a system. I mean, so it's also on that proactive side where we as just a product industry creating digital and technical products, we're still not getting a lot better. A lot of vendors are, there's a lot of good work going out there, but then when you look at these high level, what are the common weaknesses we still keep seeing? It's always the same stuff. So there's not like new families of weaknesses that we just couldn't have anticipated. It's the same weaknesses that just keep rearing their head in these products. And for a lot of them, there's known very robust solutions for them. Things like having authentication. There's so many methods of strong authentication out there, but systems aren't using them, right? Things like input sanitization. Sanitize your input. My gosh, please, please sanitize input, right? Because that's the cause of so many root vulnerabilities. And we're still just, repeatedly finding areas in products where input's not sanitized. So it's kind of those two things. So yeah, Rico?
I think, that kind of brings us to the next point of, how does the reduction of vulnerabilities take place, right? Or how do we reduce them? I think at that aspect, one of the things I'll have to tell people is cybersecurity is a participation sport. Everyone has to participate. Everyone has a role and responsibility, and our response is our responsibility. You're right. The third party items is that, nobody's really paying attention, and if they think they can set it and forget it, but in reality they can't. And a lot of times, third parties come in and they will just unrealistically unmanage their stuff, and that's gonna, like you said, keep a lot of systems up at night. It's gonna, provide a point of entry for threat actors. So, one of the things we can do is engage our third party at a fundamental level. Ask them, when's the last time they did a risk assessment? What does a risk look like? And when you start getting to the technical, tactical levels, how does this program, this application interface with us? One of the case in point in a use case was Banner Health. I was there for their breach, and it was a POS machine, and it was one of the remote hospitals over there in Phoenix, and it's like it was unmanaged, nobody paid attention, a vendor slid the product right in, and nobody was like, they're like, yeah, no problem, and it was an executive who made the decision, however did not go through the whole TPRM process. And it was just very fascinating to say, well, duh, I mean, if you had these things in place, you would have mitigated some sort of risk. So it's very, very fascinating on those.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the areas, depending for everyone listening, depending what role you play at your company, if you have anything to do with like third-party risk assessments or purchase decisions, one of the biggest things that I would like to see more companies do is make security a piece of their purchase decision. There are too many instances I've been involved with out there where they just kind of accept the security as it is in a product. Security will only get better when there's a push for vendors to do better and when there's an incentive for them to do better. So there's a certain amount of security, and there's table stakes security where you need to make a robust and resilient product, because at the end of the day, that's sort of need to. But where a lot of vendors are getting stuck is trying to get past that table stakes and actually do really good security, do differentiating security. And the reason they're stuck is because they're not seeing instances where they win purchases based on security. And so it kind of comes sort of a chicken and an egg, where we really want security to keep going farther in the industry. But if purchase decisions are not being made where security is a factor, and it's not the only factor, but it should be up there at the same level as feature functionality when you're making a purchasing decision, does the cybersecurity meet or exceed the expectation and the risk tolerance for my company, and use that as an opportunity to help the industry of product vendors grow further. Because a lot of them, they have a lot of people that want to do more security, right? They want to offer security as a differentiator, but at the end of the day, money matters, right? And they're not going to pour a tremendous amount of money into further developing robust cyber capabilities, where at the end of the day, they can't point to the fact that it will actually help them sell anymore, which may sound short-sighted, but that's how business works, right? And so I've seen a number of these scenarios where purchasers are not looking at the cybersecurity as a purchase decision, right? And so those vendors who want to make more secure, if they're not going to win because they did great security, they've got feature functionality that matches, and then at the end of the day, you kind of don't look at their security. What is incentivizing them to do better security? Nothing, really. And so if anyone plays in a part, this is one of the things I think can help reduce the number of vulnerabilities and just make generally more robust systems, is actually rewarding vendors who are doing a good thing, which pushes the whole industry forward and makes security a part of your purchase decision. If you're on the vendor side, right, if you're on the actual product side and you're making a product, when you start to see that you're losing purchases because you didn't do good cybersecurity, guess what you're going to do? You're going to do better cybersecurity, right? So it kind of works twofold, right? The vendors who want to do the right thing now have the ability to do so because they can justify the R&D dollars going to doing better security. And the vendors who didn't want to do the right thing and weren't going to do it on their own, guess what? Now they have to. So you're kind of forcing both sides of the fence, the good and the bad, who had good intentions or bad intentions. You're forcing both of them to do better cybersecurity, which raises the whole industry. So that's kind of my soapbox about more people considering cybersecurity. I want people to say no to a purchase if it does not meet their cybersecurity expectations. Push back on that vendor.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you brought up some really, really key points there in regards to who needs to have a seat at the table. Now, not only does the CISO need to have a seat at the table, I honestly believe that incident response, some sort of legal, some sort of compliance and regulatory vendor management person needs to have a seat at the table as well when it comes to purchasing, just like you said, because as soon as, especially in hospitals, you have different IoT devices, kidney pumps, diabetic pumps, cardiac machines, and EKGs, and pregnancy machines, and the list goes on, right? Imagine having to do incident response for each individual one of those. That's going to be each individual. That's over 300 products in one 200-bed hospital. So that leads to the incident response of having so much complexity. If anything, if you're going to make a decision and you're going to buy gadget A, B, and C that does cardiac, disposition, what I would say is, bring your incident responder in, bring your CISO in and say, hey, how, what is the risk going to look like on this, and help us make this decision. And so we can actually create a better, robust plan. Because at the end of the day, on these incidents and also these cyber breaches, our response is going to be our responsibility, and the public media is not going to be, every incident response I've ever dealt with, the public media is not going to be too favorable. So you have to control the narratives, and the best way to do that is to understand our roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, both of us have kind of a healthcare background, so it actually, I always think it makes a really nice or interesting case study because of the really easy understanding of human impact in the case of something goes wrong. And at the end of the day, right, if there is like a fetal feeding pump, right, that's going to keep a little baby alive better than another one, like absolutely buy that good one, right? Patient care and keeping that baby alive absolutely wins. But what I've seen the more mature hospitals do is they accept that product under conditions that, okay, over the next 2 years, we're going to see you put these security controls in place in this product. So you can still, you have so much power as the purchaser to push back on vendors who are unable to meet your security needs as it is right now, but it still is the better product and you need it. Like I get that, right? It's not always so cut and dry.
Yeah, you can make those into, your terms, conditions. Absolutely. Part of the roadmap is X, Y, and Z. We'll roll out A, B, and C of devices. And also what I've seen recently is the terms of damages of incident response as well, where they say, hey, we know an incident's going to kick off. However, we're only going to be obligated and manageable to about $1 million worth of damages. Here's our term conditions. Let me know if you agree.
Yeah. That kind of stuff is very interesting and scary.
Yeah, because it's a known risk, and we already know in this day and age, it's not a matter of how, but it's a matter of when are you going to get punched in the face, for instance. So
right. But that's like the high level, like here's the process. If you're a purchase decider, if you're someone who's actually working on a product, either maybe you're a security person and your role is to like check the security, or maybe you're actually one of just like a developer who's trying to learn more about security. Either one, making sure that security due diligence is done on that product, and that if things don't seem kosher, make sure that that is like bubbled up to the correct level. Make sure if you think there is something wrong from a security perspective, that doesn't just get pushed under the table. There's so many moving pieces in a product development life cycle that oftentimes what I've seen in various institutes back in my like consultant days is vulnerabilities would come in and you'd be triaging it, and there'd be someone who's like, oh yeah, no, we heard about something like that. The number of times where a vulnerability would come in and it'd be something that we kind of already knew about, but nobody did anything about because some developer was like, oh yeah, no, I saw that behavior. Oh my gosh, it was a little sad. There was a lot of times where it's like, oh yeah, no, we kind of knew about that behavior. We saw that in testing. It's like, oh no. So if you are somebody who's actually boots on the ground, don't let cyber stuff get swept under the rug. At the end of the day, you might not have the power to make sure something happens, but make sure it's in something like a ticketing system. Make sure it's in something like a Jira. Make sure it has the appropriate priorities put on it. And at the end of the day, if someone higher than you decides that that's not something we're going to pursue, that's okay. It's a risk-based decision. You can't fix every single vulnerability. If you feel like it's worth fighting, fight for it. But at least make sure there's this, I hate to say this, but a paper trail, because that's also how companies get better, right? So when that does happen and you can look at that and say, yeah, that ticket was opened a year ago and you chose to ignore it, that's the evidence you need for things like process improvement. So you're not going to come out of the gate immediately just 100% your processes are amazing, but make sure you don't let stuff get lost in the fray, that it's in a ticketing system somewhere, that you've done what you feel is the appropriate level of making sure people understand this is a thing. And at the end of the day, if somebody makes a risk-based decision not to fix it, that sucks at some point. But yeah, but it's on them, right? The ticketing system, you can write, blah, 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 told me that this is not going to go until the next fix. Okay. Like,
yeah,
the risk-based decision.
That's actually a good perspective on how the product identifies the incident and also the risk and issue from an incident response perspective, and how we kind of differ is, when we're doing the incident and we figure it out, because we're going in there blind, we don't know what y'all know or whoever the product is, and we just show up and we're like, hey, did you guys know this? And what happens is, if a company does that, that kind of shows negligence. And now I'm putting my lawyer hat on. It's like, now the damages are coming, now the lawsuits are coming. And if you let a product go into an environment with knowing that it could more than likely cause harm and doing these other items of interest, you probably are going to get sued, and you're probably going to lose a lot of money, or even be out of business anytime soon. So I think you're 100% right when it comes to the product side versus the incident response side. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, and for the record, like, lots of products out there have known vulnerabilities in it. It's you can never release something that has none. But again, there's some risk bar, right, where companies make and say, okay, well, I closed all the highs, right? This has like 2 known mediums, but here's compensating controls. At the end of the day, every vendor is making a risk-based decision on, is that thing secure enough? But they can't tell that if there's stuff that's just tribal knowledge that a group knows about but hasn't documented anywhere. So
what happens when the tribal knowledge leaves? That's the next question, right?
Yeah, that's always a terrible thing too.
As cyber is a huge field, as cyber is extremely wide, and there's so many companies, so many opportunities. You have one person who does cybersecurity, and all of a sudden they're like, hey, I got to go because I want to be this, I want to do that. And then you're like, oh boy, I hope we documented all that.
Yeah. Well, and so many products are complicated, right? You don't have one single development team working on the entirety of a product. So you may have a piece of like your product over here, and that development team knows there's some weird corner case, that there's an issue with that. But the other team over here that's maybe making like the main dashboard, right? They don't know that, right? Because if it's tribal knowledge, it's not making it to the other development teams. So things like the systems engineers putting everything together, they don't know about it either, because this team over here is tribal knowledge. Maybe every single person in that team knows about it, but it's tribal knowledge and it didn't get to the other team. So just the scale of some of these development efforts also make things like documentation critical.
Yes, I agree. I saw that specific use case in a electronic car company recently. I was like, oh, interesting, very fascinating, and it kind of led to the other fact of like, the other item of do we need a product security incident response team versus incident response team, and it was very interesting on how they differed, right? When I was there, it was more so, what do we do? What do we got to do to get out of the firefight? Just like when I put my U.S. Army hat back on, say, okay, we know where the fire is coming from. We know where the sectors of fire is coming from. How can we engage the enemy, and how can we eliminate it? And that's my job, to get you just out of the firefight. From a product perspective, run blind there. I know how to just get you out of the firefight. That's about it. So.
Yeah, and so one of them, I want to skip to that, like the P-cert versus C-cert, because I actually find a lot of people don't really like fully appreciate the differences or the nuance for them. So in case anyone on the line hasn't heard those acronyms before, so P-cert is product security incident response, and C-cert would be corporate security incident response. And so we mentioned earlier on that, I come from the P-cert side of the world, and Rico comes from the C-cert side of the world. And so, why are they different? So I'm going to kind of give you the P-cert perspective. So from a P-cert perspective, we're very much focused on an incident to us. In the P-cert side is someone becoming aware of a potential vulnerability in a product that has been produced by the company. And so there may not be any active exploitation of it. There may not be any active breaches. It may literally only live in a research environment. But the idea is it's still considered an incident because there's a potential vulnerability in something that we have produced. And that incident response is very much about working with things like R&D teams, trying to see what other products, can we replicate it? And so you're very much focused on trying to figure out, is this vulnerability real? If it is, what's the impact? What's the scope? Does it apply to other products? And then if all of those things, you get past all of those and you realize this is a vulnerability, there is a risk, then you go into, so how do I fix it, right? So you're working with software, firmware, hardware, you're trying to figure out what's the right level to fix this. How do I then get the fix out in patch cycles? So the product security incident response deals a lot with R&D. It deals a lot with trying to do things like risk assessment. And so I'll let Rico kind of talk to the C-cert side, but I think what you'll see is actually very different. right? At their point, like he said, like there's a fire, right? Things are going bad when CSIRT is dealing with an incident. T-CERT's kind of more like sometimes there's a hypothetical bad, right? It's a research that somebody found. And so not to say that it's not urgent, we do have timelines that we try to meet, but it's a very different environment because we're not responding to a fire that's happening. We're trying to respond to and figure out how to fix a vulnerability in a timely manner. But Rico, you want to talk us through like what does a CSIRT day look like?
Yeah, Peacer, I appreciate. I wish I was in that environment just because of the blood pressure and the sleepless nights would be amazing, right? But on the CSIRT side, it could be corporate incident response or cyber incident response, depends where you are. But at the same aspect, two different animals. We don't have time to research. We don't have time to understand. It's just more, and we have to make tough decisions like a product that's might be need a little bit more love, need a little more tender care. We're going to say, hey, cut it off right now. That's the point of entry. We don't care. This is a business decision. We don't care. Oh, it's not that we don't care. We have to make a business decision. It's going to be hard. We know it's going to affect users. It might even affect patients. But in order for us to, fix this over here, we need to cut it off. So this is what we do. And the incident response side of the house is understanding how it happened, what vulnerability was leveraged, and then we can bring it over very nicely, a nice package, and say, hey, P-CERT team, check this out. This is a vulnerability that was leveraged. Do you guys mind working with us and whatnot on the remediation side? But in the moment, time is money, and money is of the essence, and we don't have a lot of that because hours turn into millions of dollars very, very quickly. And the worst thing we can do is sit on our hands and say, well, we don't know. We need, not in a bad way. We need more time to research. There is no answer for that. I have yet to answer a CISO or a CIO says, hey, sir, I need more time, or hey, ma'am, I need more time. The answer is just not going to fly. So it's more of like, when is it remediated? When is it contained? Now, what are we going to do? At that point, it could be anywhere from 9 hours, 9 days to 9 weeks. I think the longest I ever incident response I ever worked was 19 weeks. And at the very, very end, I had to go back to the AWS and product team. This was for a major hamburger flipper company, and I went to them and I was like, "Hey guys, can we figure this out?" And they said, "Oh, we already knew about that." And I go, "Oh, that's amazing. That's great. That's fantastic." And it brings you back to that full circle of like, if we knew about it, why didn't we fix this or put some sort of compensating controls? So, we put our badge on and then we put our fireman hat on as well, and we run to the fire, and then guess what happens? Another one kicks off. So those are the two differences between P-CERT and C-CERT.
Yeah. An interesting thing is you'll find a lot of times they work in isolation. Oftentimes things are either kind of infrastructure incidents or their product incidents, but there are times when those things overlap. So you will find instances where the C-CERT and the P-CERT teams are actually working together because the incident, there may actually be a live incident. So we've had things like P-CERT incidents that were actually part of breach investigations, right? So it is actually something where there may actually be something live happening. And so P-CERT is actually called in, but they're coordinating a lot with things like C-CERT. You also find instances where there's just a need to communicate between the two. At Intel in particularly, right? Our products run our infrastructure, right? Intel runs on Intel products. So we may have things that come in through the P-CERT team that actually our C-CERT team needs to do something internal to our infrastructure, right? So there are instances where there's coordination across the two, but I will say a lot of times they kind of operate in isolation because it's just very different things that they're trying to tackle. And so one of our questions, our next one, they're about like, do you need a P-CERT and a C-CERT? And hopefully from Rico and I's descriptions, you realize they're actually incredibly different things. They're different skill sets, they're different processes, they're different stakeholders. So if you're working for a company that makes digital products, right, you probably need a P-CERT team. And if you're a company that runs on literally anything digital, you probably need a C-CERT team. Or in cases like what Rico does for consulting, you may not have a need for in-house for either of these, but you need to have those relationships where you've already put in place somebody who's going to be your incident commander, right? When something does happen, that's not when you want to try and shop for or figure out like, well, I don't have in-house team, but I need to find someone out-house, right? So if you're somebody who makes a digital product, you probably need a P-CERT capability, whether or not it's through a consultant base or in place. And if you're literally running computers and infrastructure, you should have a C-CERT capability, whether it's in-house or through consultants. Rico, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think you should have both. At least if you can't have a P-cert team, you should have a or a product champion of some sort, like an executive or whatever. Because I can guarantee you this, during the incident response, we're probably going to go to the product owner, product engineer, engineering person, system admin, infrastructure person, and say, tell me what this gadget does and tell me how to turn it off. Or tell me how to fix it. What does it do specific? I need to know because I'm about to make a decision that's going to be very, very aggressive. And so that being said, it's going to be very interesting to allocate certain portions. I know healthcare is a very lean industry where they only work on maybe like 8 to 12% marginability. So having a P-cert team might not be financial at the same aspect. Having a C-cert team is very expensive, so it might not be financially aspect. So if you can maybe merge those two, I know it's a very hard concept, but maybe possibly bring those two and have a hybrid approach. If not, I would definitely lean more towards the P-cert team because we're on the business of products.
Yeah. Yeah, with our last couple of minutes, I just want to hit on that middle one about hardware-based security because I am just an absolute like hardware security geek. And so one of the things I'll say, one of my like soapboxes I like to stand on is I feel like there's an underappreciation for the role that hardware-based security can play in systems. And some of it's just an education perspective. So I want to start with everyone on this call because you must play a role in security of something. And so one of the things I would encourage is there's a lot of layers to tackle security at. The most common one that people are really comfortable with is at things like the software layer. But as most vulnerabilities and most exploitation and breaches are usually traced back to the software layer. And while this is a broad sweeping statement and there are definitely holes in it, I'm going to say for the most part, any security done at the software layer can be undone at the software layer with a sophisticated enough attacker. So controls you put in place at the software layer, if someone has remote code execution at the software layer, at admin layer, they're going to be able to unpeel a lot of what you've done. That's one of the reasons to start looking at kind of those lower layers. So things like at the firmware layer, right? It's a higher level of execution. It has a lot more access to things on the system. It's stronger if done correctly. At the same time, right, controls done at the firmware level, if they have problems in them, you've just given away more keys to the kingdom. So everything comes with a word of caution. But what I want everyone to start to like think about is if you play a role in trying to come up with security strategies, whether it's for infrastructure or for products and you're building systems, look at all the different layers, right? Software is the easiest one to apply, but it's also the easiest one to unapply. Firmware starts to get, it's a little harder to apply, it's a little harder to unapply. When you start to get to the hardware-based layer, it's why people call it things like the root of trust, because at some layer, when you get to the hardware-based layer, you have immutable things. You have things that are just quite literally fused onto the board that are literally immutable and give you that root of trust. So depending on what you're trying to do, look at and consider when you're building those layers of defenses, don't stop at the software layer. Maybe going lower, it doesn't matter, right? Maybe the risk profile of your solution doesn't need you to go lower, but maybe it does. And so my soapbox is for people to not forget that software is the only layer for security to exist at, and that actually the lower you go into the stack, the stronger the control tends to be. So I'm a hardware security geek. Everyone out there, you should research hardware security. It's awesome.
Nice. I agree.
And with that, we're at our time where I think they're going to conduct a poll of everyone. So after the poll, we'll come back and take Q&A from the audience. So please, start throwing questions in the Q&A box. If not, I'm sure Rico and I can pontificate on many topics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And create tons of questions.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Rico. That was a really interesting and informative session. And I can tell you that because before, when the session started, we have started getting questions from then, and it's still, our question box is still flooding with a lot of questions. So there are a lot of questions for both of you to answer in the Q&A session.
All right.
Right. We'll try to be very quick on our answers.
So before we start with the Q&A session, I would like to let all our audiences know that today's session is in sync with EP Council's Incident Handler certification. Anyone with an ECIH certification is eligible for 10,000 to 11,000 plus job vacancies globally with an average salary of $76,252 per annum. So if you're interested to know more about this product, this certification, please do take part in the poll that will be on your screen right now. Okay, so Rico and Stephanie, can we please start with the Q&A?
Sure. Let's take a look here.
Okay, great.
Go for it.
The first question. Okay, so the first question is: a vulnerability is the first question is by Shivram, and he's asking: a vulnerability is only a vulnerability if identified by security researchers or hackers. Bracket 0 day. So are these white hat and black hat activities causing an increase in identified vulnerabilities?
So that's a great question. I'll see if I can answer this one. So I actually recently just dealt with a white hat hacker, and they said they not compromised, but they were able to find some information on a specific environment, blah, blah, blah. The problem with bringing some of those things to attention is there are vulnerabilities, absolutely, and there's a way to present these things to different companies, because the way they come across is as a means of extortion, and essentially you're conducting a criminal activity. So I'm putting my lawyer hat on, right? So that company that I was actually kind of working with, they actually wanted to prosecute them and actually see if there was a point of extradition, and the person was in Colombia. Very fascinating. And the U.S. has an extradition agreement with the United States with Colombia, and so they actually prosecuted this person, which was fascinating. So when it comes to vulnerabilities, just because it's discovered from a white hat hacker or cyber researcher, it really doesn't matter. What matters is that we do the right things with these vulnerabilities and present them to the people who may be affected, right?
Yeah, and what I'd add to that is, we, like at Intel, for example, we have a bug bounty program, which is becoming more of an industry norm to basically offer monetary reward for anyone who finds a vulnerability in one of our products and actually, brings it to us in a coordinated fashion. And we've found having a bug bounty program does in fact increase the number of vulnerabilities that people find and report to you, but that's kind of the idea, right? So by incentivizing the security research community, and here at Intel, I mean, we have very specific ones, we have bonuses, we'll have extra things where we're like, you know what, if you find a vulnerability in that product, you get 2 times the payout, because we really want people to look and research our devices, because we would rather somebody with good intentions find a vulnerability than someone with not good intentions. And so, some of it kind of comes back to the maturity level of the organization that you're working with. So some of the ones with bug bounty programs are pretty far in that maturity, where they've kind of come to the understanding and have the correct processes in place to work in a coordinated fashion with the security research community and disclosures. You will find instances where like what Rico spoke about, where companies either aren't at that maturity level or the researcher really isn't acting in good faith. You will find instances where researchers will come, and it will be very much an extortion-based approach where they're trying to get you to hire them to do security for them, and that's not okay. Part of those programs is they call it coordinated vulnerability disclosure because it's supposed to be coordinated. Both parties have to act in good faith. And if you look at, there was a couple years ago, there was an edit done to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, at least in the United States, and I saw something similar percolate to some of the other countries, that actually made a caveat that made security research done in good faith legal. Before that, it was very much researchers kind of taking it and hoping that the company wouldn't retaliate against them. But now they actually have some legal protection. But the key is good faith. And good faith has a lot of legal definitions. You'd have to look up what good faith is. But for the most part, you can imagine it's good faith is right. You're doing it for the right reasons, and you're not going to turn to extortion. And I said we'd keep the answers short, and then I didn't keep that short. So I apologize.
That's all right.
No, thank you so much for the answer, Stephanie and Rico. I'm sure our audience member, Shivram, I'm sure you got the answer that you were looking out for. So the second question is by Joshua, and he's asking, How do we mitigate third-party vulnerabilities in IT and IS?
Yeah,
Interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so one, it depends kind of what their underlying infrastructure is, and it depends what piece of the puzzle you're playing at. So if you're actually one of the manufacturers making those, it kind of comes back to that due diligence and hygiene that I was talking about making sure it was designed robustly. But the sort of the ownership and onus of security of a system doesn't stop just at the vendor, right? The people actually deploying those systems do play a piece in that role, right? There are expectations set by the vendor about like what permissions does this thing have on the network. You'll often see vendors say things like, okay, well, this needs to put on a network that's, you know, secured with this level certificate, and you need to load the certificate on the device. But a lot of times those things are disableable, and you'll see people kind of deploy systems and turn off things like that, right? Turn off unique certificates because it's a burden for them to actually deploy unique certs to it. Or they'll put it on an internet-facing network when the vendor's thing actually clearly specifies, I don't need internet-facing, and as part of my risk protection, I don't want to be internet-facing. And so some of it is it being designed more securely, but then some of it is also on the deployment perspective and making sure you're actually deploying it in a secure manner, putting the right controls in place on the network, and actually not disabling any security controls. A lot of devices ship in usable by default, not secure by default. And so making sure you're actually going in and then turning on security features that are available to you. I would like to see a shift where people shift secure by default, but that's just not the reality right now. They shift usable by default, meaning a lot of times most of the security is turned off. And so, Rico.
So again, back to the whole thing I said earlier was, cybersecurity is a participation sport. Get to know your vendors. Just because you buy a product, actually get to know them, develop a relationship, and understand what their incident response process is and how you can kind of, complement them. If they don't have one, that's a great opportunity to actually make one. And who knows, you might be a trailblazer in doing that. The bigger thing is to make sure that, you know what you know and you know what you don't know. If you don't know the product or the vendors, security stack, or if they're kind of wishy-washy in regards to how they respond or whatever the case may be, you kind of might want to roll it back and take that proactive approach and say, hey, I need to do a little bit more due diligence on my side of the house to mitigate this risk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the answer. So the next question is specifically for Stephanie. So Stephanie, the question is by Shivram. Since most software vulnerability categories have not changed, in brackets he has written CWE25 or OWASP 10, and developer secure coding culture seems elusive, then should cyber teams take the initiative to integrate or centralized common security libraries for key cyber functions in the code, for example, access control, encryption, etc.?
Yeah, so this is a good question. And, one of the things I did in my past life as a consultant was help build product security programs at institutes. And this was one of the things that was always, I won't call it a struggle, but there was no playbook, right? There was no one right solution. And I'm talking about the level of centralization versus decentralization of product security. And so on one hand, what they're talking about is, do you centralize everything and say any kind of capability that has a really high security risk? So things like communications libraries, do you centralize that and say that the centralized product security team picks these, maintains these, implements these? In many regards, that is, from a security perspective, the strongest approach is to centralize and unify, because it also has an impact on things like product incident response, right? You have one thing that you're supporting, right? One communications library that you have people who are very knowledgeable on. The struggle with companies that tend to go with those very centralized approaches is you tend to find there's not one solution that fits all needs. So if you're a product vendor that makes more than one thing, what you'll often find is you try to unify around a central security solution, and it just doesn't work for these products here. It doesn't work for these dev teams here. And so you end up finding you're constantly making exceptions to the rule to meet the business needs of those individual groups. And so I end up finding some kind of a hybrid approach tends to be the most impactful. The companies that really stick with that centralized solution, sometimes that works, right? Your products are not varied enough and you are able to have a centralized approach to product security. But for anyone who makes kind of a multitude of products that aren't sort of exactly cookie cutters or derivations of each other, you tend to find you have too many special exceptions and special snowflakes that centralized approach is just too rigid. So you try to find some hybrid where you centralize as much as you can, but then you have the processes in place for those exceptions. And then you still try to maybe limit the number of exceptions. Like maybe now there's 4 or 5 solutions that you support, and hope that those 4 or 5 solutions meet everyone's need. And so you still try to centralize it, but there's unfortunately not like a great answer here that works for everyone.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. The next question is by Jumeirah. He's asking, despite the implementation of appropriate elements of incident response management, why there is a recurrence? Could that be a sign of fraud?
So I think I understood the question correctly. Why is there not, it has to start with buy-in when it comes to incident response. Everyone has roles and responsibilities, and do they know that? The next thing is, do they want to do that, right? Some people are just not into incident response. I get it, it's a lifestyle. You're a firefighter, if you will. You're the responder. You're a first responder, basically. And the thing is, you got to understand too, like the reason incident response programs don't work, or incident response processes or plans just don't work, is it's a team effort. And do you have the right team to do it? If not, it's okay. If you're like, hey, the team is just not there. Something we talked about in special operations, right, was, hey, you can come to the team, no problem, but if you're just not there performing, then we need to get you back to training, get you up to snuff, then you can come back. And if you come back again and you're just not performing, this just might not be for you. So the next question would be is, who is it right for? And how can you do those repeatable process? What's the processes? What's the plan? What's the implementation? And then you start getting in the good circadian rhythm, if you will, and a good practicing the momentum. So it's a tough one, because incident response, nobody really wants to do, I've realized, because it's a really, really hard thing to do. And that's why they outsource quite a bit of it. So.
Thank you so much, Rico. The next question is by Biju, and he's asking, as we focus on hardware and software, don't you think untrained employees are one of the biggest vulnerabilities?
What was the last part? Could you say it again?
As we focus on hardware and software, don't you think untrained employees are one of the biggest vulnerabilities?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Rico.
So if you have an untrained person, that tribal knowledge, again, if you have somebody in there kind of messing around, like, well, what does this do? What does this do? And then there are things in there for a certain reason. Sure, absolutely. An untrained person can cause a lot of hard damage. So the question would be, what control are you going to put in place to have the untrained person be controlled?
Yeah, and so one of the things, like, absolutely, but that's also one of the reasons things like an untrained worker is a persona that we actually look at every time we do things like threat modeling. So digital cybersecurity isn't just about like accidental misuse or intentional misuse of the system. It's also things like untrained employees, right, who don't know what they're doing. So there are security controls put in place. If you're doing things like threat modeling well, you're anticipating those accidental misuse cases by somebody who has no nefarious intent. But security controls can actually prevent against that, right? It's why you have things like run levels and user roles and different permissions for user roles. And so you can actually put controls in place that limit the damage that somebody who is untrained on a system should be able to inflict. And remember, cybersecurity is not just about protection. If you think about NIST, right, it's not just protection, it's detection and recovery too. So if for some reason the initial protection controls fail and that uninformed user is able to do something bad on the system, do you have the things in place to actually detect that something went wrong? And then can you recover the system quickly? I also see an overinflated amount of effort put into the protect piece of cybersecurity, which is important. but they forget about the detect and recover. People will get past protect layer. They will. It will happen. So can you detect that something happened, and can you actually recover from it?
Yeah, recovery is a big part. I've seen that quite a bit where the RP or RTO are like, yeah, we know that. I'm like, well, do you really know that? Have you done that? And I'll say maybe 50% have.
Thank you so much. So the next question is, how do you balance the level of willingness and the cost of incident handling and or vulnerability management?
It's a great question. So it has to come from a bottoms up and a top down approach, right? So that means executive buy-in. You have to have also employee buy-in as well on the technical side. The one other thing I always tell people, especially executives, is look, our job is to make sure that you're not on the CNN news. That's at point blank. And once you start talking about bad media exposure, talking about financial discord, legal implications and whatnot from an executive perspective, you start getting buy-in. And I hate pushing that pain point from the bottom up. It's like, hey, can you actually do it and have the technical skill set to mitigate these vulnerabilities? If not, let's figure that out. Because when you start squishing this little hamburger together, you start actually creating a cheeseburger, right? So.
I love the team burger. I've never heard it. I love
Team
it.
burger.
Yeah. But, one of the things, that's kind of both scary and exciting about the cyber world, as Rico mentioned, there's actually very few things that can kind of close a company overnight, right? Or can cause a company to fold. If you're making good products, right, people are happy. Cyber is one of those things, right? A breach that is not handled correctly can cause a company to go down for a multitude of reasons. It can be that you've lost your intellectual property, you've lost all of your customer data, the enforcement fee is so high that you cannot keep the doors open anymore. You've lost customer trust and reputation. An incident that is not handled correctly is actually one of probably a short list of things that can cause an otherwise healthy company to crumble. And so having things like incident response, whether it's the P-Cert or the C-Cert, are so critical because those are two of those big risk areas, quite literally, for a company to be able to maintain and keep operating. And either of those not handled correctly can be a really, really short path to closure of your company.
Very true.
Thank you so much. And now we are going to take the last question for the evening. Last question is from Saurav, and he's asking how we identify that the vulnerabilities that are occurring, if they are high severity or low severity, and what happens if we ignore a high severity vulnerability in any case.
You want to take it first, Rico, from a C-Cert perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So fidelity really has to do based upon your business approach and your business environments. What might be a high fidelic finding or observation or vulnerability to a healthcare company may not be to a financial firm or to a retailer. So it really depends on the specific specificities of the business impact that I'll have. However, if you fine tune your SIM or your log monitoring or whatever, if you can actually pay attention and make those more around to your business justification, you'll be in a better position than you were.
Yeah, and from the product side, talking about maybe at like the product level vulnerability, honestly, all of that stuff is a risk-based decision that company has to make based on their risk tolerance. So there are a number of different ranking algorithms and stuff you can do out there, but at the end of the day, you as a company have to figure out what's your risk-based tolerance and what is the specific sort of impact of your system. Remember, if you're selling something, it's going into somebody else's environment. So what role is it playing? So, we've talked about things like medical devices. Okay, well, a medical device that has something go wrong with it, impact is very high, stakes are very high. So your risk-based equation when you're making a medical device, anything that has the ability to like alter patient care should absolutely be a high, and you should fix that. But if you're making like a lemonade stand game on an Android app and somebody's able to manipulate and like change the character or change the money, maybe you don't care at all, right? But the ability to get full code execution inside the medical device, that's end game, right? But full code execution in my lemonade game, maybe not. Maybe I don't care that much. So much of it comes down to like, what is the impact of that thing once it goes into its actual environment where it's going to be used? And then at the end of the day, you have to make that risk-based decision. I would hope no medical device manufacturer makes this, but nobody forces them to close high-level vulnerabilities, right? They can have a high and say, I'm okay with this risk-based decision. They have to present all that to the FDA and say, like, I've assessed this. I'm comfortable with this risk-based decision. Here's the evidence. I think it's actually not that bad. At the end of the day, like, that's their reputation on the line. Nobody forces anybody to close high-level vulnerabilities. But to Rico's earlier point, if something bad happens and it becomes knowledge that you knew about that high-level vulnerability, oh, you're going to be on the barbecue. Like, that's so bad. But you made a risk-based decision to move forward anyway. And that's doable. You can do that.
Very true.
Yeah, I think we're out of time. So if we didn't answer everyone's questions, you know, Rika and I, we're on LinkedIn.
Yeah,
you can find us.
Send them on over. Yeah, absolutely. All right.
Is there an official closeout, or do we just say bye?
Yeah, I don't. Go ahead.
Seriously,
I heard her for a second.
Yeah, it's okay.
All right. Well, I'm going to thank everyone for coming.
Having a bit of yes, Lucia is having, I think, a bit of a trouble. So thank you so much, Stephanie and Rico. Any last words before we close up?
Just remember your responsibility, and you have to be your own first responder.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stephanie?
Just if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm passionate on this topic, as you can tell, and Rico.
Sure. So for our attendees, if some of your questions haven't been answered, we'll pass them on to our speakers and get back to you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. It was such an informative session, and you may now disconnect the lines. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.